After the Israelites miraculously crossed the Jordan River on dry ground and built the memorial of stones, it's almost time for them to conquer the land of Canaan and fight the Battle of Jericho. But first, they have some preparing to do, because there's been some important practices that they've been neglecting, and now it's time to get back on track. So in today's Bible study, we're looking at Joshua 5, where the Israelites are preparing for the Promised Land. Hi, my name is David Cipriano. I'm a youth pastor, and here on this channel, we're currently going through the book of Joshua. We're going through this book chapter by chapter and verse by verse. So far, we've been doing one chapter per episode, and we're learning not just the stories of the Bible, but some practical applications that we can take away for our lives. And in today's Bible study, we're looking at how the Israelites are getting ready at Gilgal and how they're preparing for the Promised Land. So let's look at Joshua chapter 5, and we'll just read the first two verses as we begin here. And it came to pass, when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel, until we were passed over, that their heart melted, neither was their spirit in them any more, because of the children of Israel. At that time the Lord said unto Joshua, Make these sharp knives, and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. So in Joshua 5, Israel is preparing to conquer the Promised Land, but first they have to get ready at Gilgal. Gilgal is the location for this entire chapter, and so I first want to say a few things about Gilgal. For one, Gilgal was located just west of the Jordan River near Jericho. So they had just crossed the Jordan, and Gilgal was the location between the Jordan River and Jericho. Another thing about Gilgal is that the name means rolling or to roll away. And we're going to look at this in more detail later, but we see the name coming from verse 9. It says, And the Lord said unto Joshua, This day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you, wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day. So the name Gilgal means rolling or to roll away, and it's a specific reference to how the reproach of Egypt had been rolled away from the Israelites. Next thing is that Gilgal was a place of remembrance, repentance, and restoration. So Gilgal is a place where people remembered God, in other words, building memorials toward God. It was a place where the Israelites repented from their sins, and it was a place where they were restored into the fellowship of God, hence the name Gilgal, because their reproach was rolled away. And then finally, Gilgal served as Israel's headquarters during the conquest of Canaan. So this was a place that the Israelites would return back to periodically, especially after battles. So whether they won the battle or they lost the battle, they would return to the headquarters. So Joshua 5 is about getting ready at Gilgal, where we see the Israelites preparing for the Promised Land. And hopefully you see this throughout the Bible study, but the main theme here is obedience to God. So there's four main events that happen in this chapter. The first one is circumcising the men. Verses 2 and 3 say this, At that time the Lord said unto Joshua, Make these sharp knives, and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. And Joshua made him sharp knives, and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. Now circumcision was an Old Testament command, and all of the male Israelites were bound to it. But I think it's important to realize that circumcision is not a command for today. Now, in the early church, there were many people who believed that circumcision was necessary for salvation and that an uncircumcised man couldn't be saved, and that's one of the causes for the book of Galatians. And in the book of Galatians, Paul makes it very clear that not only do you not have to get circumcised for salvation, but it's not really a command for believers today at all. Now, a person certainly can get circumcised. There are some health benefits to doing that, but we should also realize that it's not a command for today. And so if a person chooses not to get circumcised, or if parents choose to not circumcise their baby boy, this is not a sin according to the Bible. But as we look at the people in Joshua's day, they were bound to circumcision. A Jewish man of that time was living in sin if he didn't get circumcised. Circumcision was a sign of a covenant, and it was a mark of God's people. And sadly, it was a practice that the Israelites had been neglecting. We see that in verses 4 and 5. It says, "And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise all the people that came out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness by the way, after they came out of Egypt. Now all the people that came out were circumcised, but all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way, as they came forth out of Egypt, them they had not circumcised." So essentially, we have this entire generation of men who aren't circumcised. And so as a result, the people have reproach on them. They have been living in disobedience to God, so now they have to get circumcised. This was one of the ways that they were preparing for the promised land. And as we look at this event of circumcision in the book of Joshua, here's 3 things to note about it. The first is that circumcision made them sore. Now, I won't go into too much detail here for good reason, but circumcision was a very painful process. I mean, circumcision was supposed to be done shortly after birth, and it's painful for babies, but it is a way more painful thing for adults to go through it. There was a reason why the people hadn't been doing it in so long, and there is a reason why the men of Israel would be very hesitant to obey this command. And I think that there's a lesson here, and it's that sometimes God's instructions are painful. Hey, that was the case for the Israelites here, because God had told them to do something, but it would really hurt. It would make them sore. It was a very unpleasant process. And that's how obedience often is in our lives. Sometimes God tells us to do something that we don't want to do. Hey, maybe for you that thing is sacrifice. Maybe God's been telling you to give up something, but you don't want to give it up. Maybe God's been telling you to forgive somebody who has wronged you, but you don't want to do that because it would hurt to forgive them. Maybe God has been telling you to end a relationship or a friendship, but you are hesitant because ending that thing would hurt. Maybe you ought to confess a certain sin to somebody, but you know that it would be very awkward and embarrassing. Hey, obedience to God often is painful. It's often a difficult thing to do, and that's the case with circumcision here. Circumcision made them sore. The next thing that we see is that circumcision made them susceptible. In other words, whenever the people got circumcised, this would make them vulnerable to the attack of the enemy, because they would be in such pain, they would have to take a few days off to recover, and now they've essentially made themselves easy targets for an invading army. You see, after the Jordan River, it might have made sense for this to be the perfect time to strike against the Canaanites. I mean, Rahab said back in chapter 2 that the Canaanites had already been afraid of the Israelites until the Red Sea, and now after people have heard about how the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, the people are even more scared of them. If we read verse 1 again, it says, "And it came to pass, when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel, until we were passed over, that their heart melted, neither was their spirit in them any more, because of the children of Israel." So their enemies are afraid of them. They have no more spirit in them, and this seems like the perfect opportunity for the Israelites to conquer them. But instead, all of the men get circumcised first, thus making themselves easy targets for their enemies. There's a story from the book of Genesis about Jacob's daughter Dinah and her brothers. Making a long story short, Dinah goes out and a man named Shechem defiles her. Now, I think that the Bible is a little bit unclear about whether or not this story is assault or if it was consensual. But either way, what he did was wrong, and yet he wants to marry her. Now, Jacob's sons don't want for him to marry her because they hate him. They hate the way that he's defiled their sister. So instead of just telling him, no, you can't marry our sister, they instead make a deal with him. They say that if all of the men of the city get circumcised first, then he can marry Dinah. Now, his father was the prince. He was in charge. And so he would have had authority to make all of the men get circumcised. And so they do this. But then shortly after their circumcision, while the men of the city were weak and vulnerable, Jacob's sons kill all of the soldiers and they loot the city. You see, they realized that if they could get the men to be circumcised, then they could easily kill them, they could easily defeat them, and they could just take over just like that, because these men, in their weakened state, were defenseless. Circumcision made those men vulnerable, and now Israel was doing it to themselves. You know, sometimes God calls us to do things that might seem to us like a bad idea. And so when we obey, we're really having to trust God to provide for us no matter what. Hey, steps of faith often make us vulnerable. And the Israelites throughout the book of Joshua do a lot of things that seem pretty risky because God told them to do it. For example, whenever they crossed the Jordan River, they were trapping themselves into the land with no retreat. There was no going back over the Jordan. And so whenever they cross the Jordan, they are really burning the ships, so to speak. It made the Israelites vulnerable whenever they got circumcised at Gilgal because they're now easy targets. In the next chapter, chapter 6, the Israelites are going to march around the city of Jericho, and this was a plan that kind of made them look silly. You see, steps of faith often make us feel vulnerable. And maybe God has been calling you to do something that you don't want to do because you don't want to take the risk, and that's really just a sign of weak faith. Hey, maybe God's been calling you to start tithing, but you feel like you wouldn't be able to afford it. Maybe God's been calling you to be honest about something and to come clean about something that you've done, even though you would get in trouble for it. Maybe God has been telling you to admit a mistake. Maybe God's been telling you to wait on his timing and stop rushing the process, but you feel like you would be in danger if you didn't move ahead right now. Maybe there's been a situation that you've been in, and it's important for you to take a stand for biblical truth, but you're afraid of the backlash if you were to agree with God on this issue. Maybe you've really been struggling with something and you know that you need to get help, but you're afraid to get transparent about it. Hey, steps of faith often make us feel vulnerable, and that's what the Israelites have to do right here. They have to make themselves easy targets for their enemies, but this was the necessary thing to do in order to obey God. The third thing that we see about circumcision here is that circumcision made them sanctified. Let's read verses 4 and 5 again. And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise all the people that came out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness by the way after they came out of Egypt. Now all the people that came out were circumcised, but all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way as they came forth out of Egypt, them they had not circumcised. So circumcision was a command by God. God hadn't ended this command, and yet the people have taken a break from it, meaning that they're not sanctified. They're living in disobedience to God. And to just give us some background on circumcision so that we can understand how important this was, we have to go back to Genesis 17, where this command really began. God said to Abraham here, "And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. So this was a ritual that God had commanded, but the people had been neglecting it for a long time. And this was just another evidence of how the previous generation of Israelites was disobedient to God. Because first, they had doubted that God could give them the victory in the promised land. That's why they were stuck in the wilderness. And they also didn't circumcise their children. So now a whole generation of men had been uncircumcised. And now it's painful to get circumcised. It is really inconvenient, and it's even dangerous. But it's time for them to stop putting it off. And to really apply these biblical principles to our lives, let me just ask you, what has God commanded that you've been putting off? What has God told you to do that you've been neglecting? I mean, maybe God's been telling you to confess a sin to somebody. Maybe he's been telling you to start doing your devotions. Maybe it's time for you to finally quit that addiction. Maybe it's time for you to reach out to a struggling friend who needs help. Maybe you have a family member or a friend who is unsaved and they haven't heard the gospel clearly presented, and maybe it's time for you to share it with them. Maybe God's been calling you to surrender to full-time Christian service. Hey, I don't know who all is listening to this. I don't know what the Holy Spirit is trying to do in your life, but hey, it's time to get right. If God's commanded you to do something and yet you haven't done it, then do it now. Even if now seems like the worst possible time. I mean, remember how Israel crossed the Jordan a couple of chapters ago, and this was really a big step of faith for them. And as if this wasn't a big deal already, they're doing it during the flood season. I mean, they weren't waiting for the best time or the easiest time. And that's often how God works in our lives, where we have to depend on him when it seems the most impossible, when it seems the most inconvenient. And here's just another reminder for you to stop waiting for the perfect time to step out in faith. I mean, the perfect time doesn't exist, and it's never going to happen. So just obey God now. This was the position that the Israelites were in. I mean, this seems like the worst time ever to get circumcised, and yet God has told them to do it now. So instead of waiting for a better time or a more convenient time or a safer time, the people do it now at Gilgal instead of just putting it off. And when they do it, they become sanctified again. Verses 8 and 9 say, And it came to pass, when they had done circumcising all the people, that they abode in their places in the camp till they were whole. And the Lord said unto Joshua, This day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you, wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day. So remember earlier we talked about how Gilgal got its name because the name means rolling or to roll away. And so now that the people have become circumcised, their reproach has been rolled away. They're sanctified again, and they're living in obedience to God again. So the first main event here is circumcising the men. The second one is commemorating the Passover. Verse 10 says, And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal, and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains of Jericho. Now the Passover was a Jewish festival celebrating the exodus from Egypt and freedom from slavery. And in the Passover, God had instituted a commemorative meal. This meal consisted of a lamb, bitter herbs, unleavened bread. And if we were to go back to that first ever Passover night, this was on the same night as the 10th plague of Egypt, which was the death of the firstborn. All of the firstborn people and animals in the land of Egypt were going to die, but there would be an opportunity for salvation. You see, the Israelites were told to take that Passover lamb's blood and to put it on their doorposts. And so whenever God passed through the land killing the firstborns, God would see the blood and spare that one from death. And this is really a picture of the gospel that was to come. This is an illustration of Jesus' death on the cross, because the blood of the lamb would save the people. I mean, it wasn't about how good they were, or how righteous they were, or about how many bad sins they hadn't committed. No, it was just all about having the blood of the lamb. And the same thing is true about salvation, because God doesn't just save us because we're good enough, or because we're holy enough, or because we haven't done some really horrible crime yet. No, it's all about the blood of Jesus. It's not something that we work for or that we earn. It's something that's given to us because of Christ, and whenever we believe in Him. And this is where we get the words for the Christian hymn, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." And now the Israelites are keeping the Passover again. And in this, they are obeying God's command. They are remembering their rescue from Egypt, and they're picturing the future death of Christ. Now, it might surprise you to hear this, but this is only the third Passover that Israel ever kept in their history. The first one was on the night of the 10th plague of Egypt. The second time was 1 year after that, but then afterwards, they never kept it again until now. So they go about 40 years without doing it. And so now it's the first time that they keep the Passover in the land of Canaan. This was identifying them as God's people. This was them remembering what God has done for them. This was them becoming obedient once again to the commands of God. And it's picturing the gospel. The next main event that happens in this chapter is changing their diets. Verse 12 says, "And the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year." Now, when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness for those 40 years, they didn't really have much food. So God gave them bread from heaven, which was called manna, which means, "What is it?" Because whenever the people saw it, that's what they asked. And this manna appeared on the ground each morning, and it sustained them as their primary food. But now that they've gone into the land of Canaan, the manna has been cut off. It has ceased. And the people now have to start farming the land of Canaan, providing for their own food once again. And so for the Israelites, this was really a new era for them with some new responsibilities. And you can probably relate to this concept, because often we enter into a new season of life, and with that new season usually comes some new responsibilities. I mean, as I've become older, I've gradually gotten more and more responsibilities. Like, I remember whenever I got my first job, I remember moving out of my parents' house and going off to college. I remember being in my first relationship and having some responsibilities and duties as a boyfriend. Whenever I became a youth pastor, I had some new responsibilities that I hadn't had before. I'm a husband, and that has responsibilities as well. And you can probably think of some different seasons and stages of your life, how you took a big step, you moved into a new era, and with that time came some new responsibilities. And that's where the Israelites are. Because they've crossed the Jordan, they've entered the promised land, and now they have a new responsibility of providing for their food. God wasn't going to be miraculously providing them with manna any longer, and so they have to get food the normal way. You see, there comes a time when something stops being given to you, and you have to start earning it. And sometimes we don't like earning it. We wish that it could just be given to us forever. But it's really good for us as we step into these new seasons and these new responsibilities to start taking accountability in this way. Now, so far in Joshua 5, we've seen how they circumcised the men, how they've commemorated the Passover, how they've changed their diets because there's no more manna anymore. And then finally, this is my favorite point here, they are connecting with God. This point is the last thing to happen in the chapter, but it's certainly not the least. We sort of saved the best for last year. So let's read verses 13 through 15. And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him, and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. Now, in the very beginning, Joshua doesn't realize it, but this is a theophany. Theophany is kind of a fancy theological term, but what it means is that God has come down to earth in physical, visible form. Now, sometimes a theophany is referred to as a Christophany specifically, where it's the person of Jesus Christ, but you could also just use the more generic term theophany, and this could include any member of the Godhead. And in the Bible, there are a few theophanies in the Old Testament. You're probably familiar with these cases, even if you don't know the word theophany. For one, God appeared to Abraham when he came to the land that God promised to him and his descendants. That was in Genesis 12. Another time was whenever Jacob wrestled with who appeared to be a man, but was actually God in the flesh. That was Genesis 32. In Exodus 3, God appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush. And then in Deuteronomy 31, God appeared to Moses and Joshua when the leadership role was being transferred. God also answered Job out of the tempest, and he responded to his questions. That's in Job 38 to 42. So there's been many theophanies in the Bible, and now God is appearing to Joshua. And at first, like many of these other cases, Joshua doesn't realize that it's God. And so Joshua asks this man a question, Are you for us or against us? He says, Art thou for us or for our adversaries? And God's answer was neither. He said, Nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. Now you might be wondering to yourself, why did God answer like this? Because Joshua said, Are you for us or against us? And God basically just says, Neither. And the reason why is not because God was neutral. It wasn't because God didn't really have a side or because God didn't care who won the battle. It was because Joshua was asking the wrong question. You see, it wasn't about whether or not God was on their side, but about whether or not they were on God's side. And I think that it's good for us to consider the same. Now, yes, in a sense, God is on our side. Psalm 118:6 says, The Lord is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do unto me? Paul said in Romans 8:31, What shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? So I'm not trying to say here that God is not on your side, but that's not really where the emphasis is here, because it's not about whether or not God's on your side, but about whether you are on God's side. So stop asking, is God on my side? And start asking, am I on God's side? I think that we ought to be considering this question whenever we make the decisions in life, such as relationships. Instead of just asking God, do you support this? Go to God and say, God, is this what you want? Whenever you start trying to get a job, don't just be saying, God, are you on my side? But ask God, am I on your side here? Whenever you try to figure out what to do with your life, instead of just wondering whether or not God is going to support you and help you get what you want, say to God, let me align my will with yours. Because it's not, will God support me, but am I doing what God wants? It's not about God following you, it's about you following God. And as we look at Joshua with this captain of the Lord's host, I just love the way that Joshua relates to God. At first, Joshua doesn't realize that it's God. He thinks that it's just another human being. But as soon as Joshua realizes that it's God, he worships him. And when God tells him to remove his shoes because he's standing on a holy ground, then he does it in obedience. You see, Joshua has a progression here because at first he's ignorant. He doesn't know who it is. Whenever he realizes who it is, he worships God. And when God tells him to do something, he becomes obedient. Now, Joshua's meeting with God here really sets the tone for the rest of the book, because in his preparation, he has to meet with God. He's going to be doing a lot of big things, a lot of scary things. He has a tremendous responsibility as the leader of Israel. So as he's getting ready to do all of this, he has to meet with God. And I think that this is a good precedent for all of us, that whenever we're about to do something big, we also spend time with God, putting first things first. And I also want to notice this detail about many of the Theophanies in the Bible, and it's that God's appearance is especially relevant to that individual. So whenever God appeared to Abraham, who was a pilgrim, God came as a traveler to share in a friendly meal. Whenever God appeared to Jacob, who was a deceiver, he came as a wrestler to bring Jacob to the point of submission. Whenever God joined Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he appeared to them as a friend in the burning fiery furnace. And whenever God meets with Joshua, who's about to be a military leader in the conquest of Canaan, God meets him as the captain of the Lord's host. You see, God is always exactly what we need. God knows our needs, He knows our insufficiencies, He knows what we're going into, and so God gives us exactly what we need. Now, this isn't always exactly what we want, but it's always what we need. So as we look at this chapter of the book of Joshua, chapter 5, the theme, as I said earlier, is obedience to God. And this chapter really teaches us a lot of lessons about obedience, and here's 4 of them. The first is that obedience to God may be painful, but it should always be a priority. We saw that with circumcision, because this was a very painful step, but it had to be done. Second lesson is that obedience to God may make us vulnerable, but He gives us a victory. For the Israelite men, circumcision made them vulnerable because it made them weak, it made them an easy target to their enemies, but whenever they were doing this, they were trusting in God to give them the victory. The third lesson is that obedience to God is often neglected, but it's never too late to start again. You see, the Israelites had been neglecting God in many ways. They had neglected God in their circumcision, in keeping the Passover, but instead of just giving up on these people, God shows them that it's never too late to start again, because now they had an opportunity to get right with God. And then the fourth lesson is that obedience to God is about you being on God's side, not about God being on your side. We saw this whenever Joshua asks God about whether or not God is for them or against them, and God basically tells them neither, because it was about whether or not they were on God's side, not about whether God was on their side. And if we are going to live a life of faith and obedience to God, it's about our will aligning with His, not the other way around. Well, I really hope that this Bible study was a help to you. If it was, then please click the like button so that the platform will promote this type of content to a bigger audience. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.